Lions live across Africa, with one small, isolated population clinging on in a single forest in India. Jaguars live in Central and South America, thousands of miles away, separated from lions by an entire ocean and a continent that never touches either species' range at any point. The two animals look nothing alike, one carrying a heavy mane and hunting in open grassland prides, the other built stockier and lower to the ground, patterned in dark rosettes and hunting alone through dense rainforest and riverbanks. By every modern measure, these two cats have had zero opportunity to ever meet, let alone breed with each other. When scientists finally compared their complete genomes side by side, the DNA told a completely different story. Lions and jaguars interbred in the deep past, and the proof of it is still sitting inside a living jaguar's skull today, quietly shaping one of the most powerful bites in the entire animal kingdom. Start with why that finding looks impossible on the surface. Modern lions and jaguars don't just live on separate continents, they belong to a genus, Panthera, that includes 5 living species total: the lion, tiger, jaguar, leopard, and snow leopard, the only cats on Earth capable of producing a true roar rather than a purr, a distinction rooted in the specific structure of a small bone and cartilage assembly in their throats. Genetic dating places the common ancestor of all 5 somewhere between 3.5 and nearly 6 million years ago, with lions, leopards, and jaguars forming their own closer branch within that group sometime after an earlier split from the lineage leading to tigers and snow leopards. That branch didn't originate in Africa or the Americas, the two regions most people would instinctively associate with lions and jaguars today, based purely on where each species happens to live right now. The evidence instead points to Asia, the region where the broader Panthera lineage most likely first diversified before individual species pushed outward in different directions across multiple continents over the following few million years, each one eventually settling into the very different habitats and hunting styles that make them look almost unrelated today. Jaguar ancestors eventually made their way into the Americas by crossing the Bering land bridge connecting Siberia and Alaska, the same route used by mammoths, horses, and countless other Ice Age mammals moving between continents whenever falling sea levels exposed dry ground between the two land masses, a temporary highway that opened and closed repeatedly across hundreds of thousands of years as glacial cycles came and went. Lion ancestors spread in the opposite direction entirely, into Africa and across a much wider swath of Europe and Asia than the species occupies today, at various points ranging from the southern tip of Africa up through the Middle East and into parts of India and beyond, making the lion, at its historical peak, one of the most widely distributed land predators anywhere on the planet. Long before either animal looked or lived the way it does now, their ancestors' ranges almost certainly overlapped somewhere across that shared Asian homeland, closing the geographic gap that makes the modern animals seem like total strangers, separated by nothing but ocean and continental drift. If you're finding this interesting, be sure to subscribe to understand more DNA from the past. Confirming that overlap actually produced interbreeding rather than just shared geography with no lasting genetic consequence required reading the full genetic code of all 5 Panthera species side by side, something nobody had managed until relatively recently in the history of genomic science. Lion, tiger, and snow leopard genomes already existed by the early 2010s, largely because captive populations in zoos and breeding centers made high-quality samples easier to obtain safely, but jaguar and leopard genomes did not, leaving a real frustrating gap in any attempt to compare the whole genus at once using consistent, directly comparable data. In 2017, an international research team sequenced both the jaguar and leopard genomes for the first time and combined them with the existing 3 into a single unified analysis, published in the journal Science Advances, the most complete genomic picture the genus had ever received in one place at one time. Across the 5 genomes, the team identified more than 13,000 genes shared by every living Panthera species. The baseline genetic toolkit inherited directly from their common ancestor millions of years earlier and preserved, largely unchanged, across every subsequent split. The goal was to finally map out, with real genetic data instead of decades of guesswork based on skulls, skins, and behavioral observation, exactly how and when these five predators split apart from one another and settle a question paleontologists had argued over for generations. Instead, the genomes told several different contradictory stories depending on which stretch of DNA researchers happened to examine, a pattern that shouldn't exist at all if the five species had simply split cleanly from a shared ancestor and never touched again afterward. Two explanations could account for that contradiction, and both are well documented in population genetics more broadly. The first, incomplete lineage sorting, is an ordinary statistical quirk that shows up when a species splits into several new lineages in rapid succession before old genetic variation carried by the shared ancestor has time to sort itself out evenly across every new branch. Essentially a matter of unlucky timing rather than any real biological contact between species. The second explanation was far stranger and far more specific. That these species, separated across entire continents today, had actually kept mating with each other long after becoming genetically distinct enough to be considered separate species by every other measure available to biologists. To tell the two apart, researchers ran a class of statistical tests called D-statistics, which measure whether shared genetic variants between two species cluster in patterns random chance and lineage sorting alone could produce, or whether they concentrate in specific repeated ways that only direct interbreeding between two particular lineages could realistically explain. The logic works something like checking a family's finances for a hidden loan. A few scattered similarities between two accounts could be coincidence, but a large, concentrated block of matching activity in specific places means money genuinely changed hands at some point. The results here were unambiguous. Actual historical hybridization, not statistical noise left over from a fast radiation millions of years ago, had left its signature across the genus repeatedly in specific and identifiable places researchers could point to directly rather than merely infer. The clearest and most consequential signal to emerge from the entire analysis involved lions and jaguars directly. Despite millions of years of separation and today an entire ocean between their ranges, the genomic data showed unmistakable evidence that lion and leopard ancestors had interbred with the jaguar lineage at some point in the deep past, leaving detectable lion genetic material embedded directly inside the modern jaguar genome, still present and fully readable millions of years later by anyone with the right sequencing technology. Researchers didn't stop at simply confirming the crossing happened somewhere back in the genus's history. They mapped exactly where in the jaguar genome that inherited material showed up and found it clustered suspiciously close to genes tied to skull shape and jaw development, including a gene called ESRP1, already known from studies in other mammals to influence craniofacial growth during early embryonic development. Jaguars possess the strongest bite force relative to body size of any cat alive today, powerful enough to pierce turtle shells and crocodilian skulls directly, prey items no other big cat on Earth can safely tackle the way a jaguar routinely does in the rivers and wetlands it hunts through. Researchers now suspect that inherited genetic material may have contributed directly to that unusually powerful, heavily reinforced skull structure, meaning part of what makes a jaguar's bite so devastating today may trace back to genes borrowed from an animal it has never once shared a continent with in all of recorded natural history. Subscribe to not miss the next one. That single crossing wasn't an isolated event either, and it wasn't even the only hybridization signal lions specifically carried throughout their genome. Across the full 5-species comparison, the lion lineage carried the most widespread signature of ancient hybridization of any Panthera species examined, showing detectable genetic exchange with multiple other lineages beyond just the jaguar connection, more extensive contact with relatives than any of the other 4 cats combined managed to accumulate. Researchers believe that pattern traces directly back to the lion's own remarkable and largely unmatched history. No other Panthera species has ever occupied a range as large as the lion once did at its historical peak, stretching from the southern tip of Africa through the Middle East, deep into India, and at various points into parts of southern Europe as well, putting ancient lion populations into repeated geographic contact with nearly every other big cat lineage at one point or another across that enormous, continuously shifting territory. A wider range simply meant more chances to cross paths with a related species somewhere along the edges of that territory, and more chances to leave a lasting genetic signature behind in a neighboring lineage long after the two had otherwise gone their separate evolutionary ways for good. The same study also uncovered a pattern connecting these ancient hybridization events to a genuine biological purpose beyond simple coincidence or accidental proximity. The genes showing signs of historical introgression weren't scattered randomly through the genome the way pure chance would predict if the crossings meant nothing functionally. They clustered specifically around traits like craniofacial structure, sensory perception, and reproduction, the exact categories of adaptation that would give a genuinely struggling population a real, measurable survival advantage, rather than just a cosmetic or superficial change with no bearing on survival at all. Panthera populations went through repeated severe declines during the harsh climate swings of the Pleistocene, crashing to small fractions of their former numbers more than once as ice ages reshaped available habitat and prey populations again and again across multiple continents over hundreds of thousands of years. Researchers suspect that during those population bottlenecks, occasional interbreeding with a neighboring species may have injected badly needed genetic diversity into populations that might otherwise have been pushed toward extinction entirely, along with the occasional genuinely useful trait, like a stronger, more capable skull, riding along for the ride and eventually becoming permanently fixed in whichever population happened to inherit it. That shared history carries real weight for both species today, well beyond simply satisfying scientific curiosity about an old and complicated family tree. Modern lions have lost roughly 90% of their historic range across Africa and the Middle East, with the species now classified as vulnerable overall and the small isolated Asiatic population surviving in India's Gir forest, numbering only a few hundred individuals, considered critically vulnerable to exactly the kind of genetic bottleneck the Pleistocene ancestors of all 5 Panthera species managed to survive by occasionally crossing paths with a neighboring lineage at just the right moment. Jaguars have fared somewhat better in raw total numbers, but have still lost roughly half their historic range across Central and South America, squeezed by ongoing deforestation and habitat fragmentation into increasingly small, isolated pockets of remaining forest. Understanding that both species' genomes still carry the fingerprints of ancient crossings, survival strategies effectively written into their DNA millions of years before either population ever faced its current human-driven pressures, gives conservation researchers a genuinely useful historical reference point for judging how resilient or how fragile a shrinking big cat population can realistically become under sustained pressure. Line up everything the genomes actually revealed, and the modern picture of lions and jaguars as complete strangers, separated cleanly by continents and millions of years, doesn't hold up under closer scrutiny. Two predators separated today by an entire ocean, built for different climates, hunting different prey, using entirely different strategies on different continents, were never as isolated from each other as their current ranges suggest at first glance. Their ancestors crossed paths somewhere across Asia millions of years ago, long before jaguars ever set foot in the Americas and long before lions ever set foot in sub-Saharan Africa. And that crossing left a mark specific enough for modern genome sequencing to trace directly to one of the most physically distinctive traits either species possesses: the sheer, bone-crushing strength of a jaguar's bite, still functioning exactly as intended every time the animal closes its jaws on prey nothing else in the rainforest can safely catch. The five big cats making up Panthera were never the cleanly separated branches on a simple family tree that scientists confidently assumed for over a century of study. They were, and in some documented cases still are, a genus that never fully stopped exchanging pieces of itself, even across distances and time spans that make the word family feel almost too generous a description for how far apart these five animals have drifted since.